Hi there, and welcome to week 1 of missional anthropology. And in this week, we're going to be looking at, really as an introductory idea of what is the relationship between mission and missions and anthropology as a discipline. Now, you might think that there is more in common or less in common than you might think, and so I want to give you a little bit of a broad strokes, very brief historical background as to the relationship between mission and anthropology, and between missionaries and anthropologists. Now, to start off with, I'll give you a quote that I think is quite pertinent to our understanding. It's probably fair to say that there has been an ambivalent relationship between missions and missionaries and anthropologists. Goldschmidt says in his idea here that missionaries are in many ways our opposites. They wish to change the people we wish to study. We view them as spoilers. I think that really sums up very often the relationship between missions and anthropologists. We wish to change the people we study. We want to present them with the gospel and ultimately see them be different, they say. And they wish to just simply observe. They're not there to change anything. So when we make changes to those communities, so they become different, we're actually spoiling what was there already. So they've concluded that Christianity, of course, is no different than any other religion. It's a cultural byproduct. It's human-made. It's not God-given. And because there's so few anthropologists, relatively speaking, with a personal Christian faith, it's not surprising that a fair amount of antagonism towards missionaries has come from anthropologists. As I said, Goldschmidt, perhaps the most vocal of those, by calling them spoilers. So in the statement, by calling missionaries spoilers, they suggest that missionaries have this mission that they are trying to accomplish that actually destroys cultures and doesn't actually lift them up. Now, the antithesis to that, of course, is the fact that anthropologists themselves, just merely by having a presence in a community, if you to picture a primitive tribe with an anthropologist sitting to the side just recording notes, the very presence of them being there does make a difference. It's not as if they're invisible, so it's probably a little bit overstated. But their lack of appreciation or understanding of missionaries is of course well documented. Now, anthropologists have frequently stereotyped missionaries as narrow-minded destroyers of culture, and unfortunately, there's more truth to that than we would probably like to admit. In fact, in some ways, we might well say, guilty as charged. We have, at times in missionary history, because of the missionaries themselves, they're flawed, they're human beings, they have been unable to distinguish between what is culture and what is Christianity. And they have actually brought those two things together, and in some cases, even to this day, missionaries tend to do that at times. And at the same time, missionaries tend to have a view of anthropologists that is perhaps a little unfair as well. Some of you might be familiar with the show Bones, which deals with a forensic anthropologist who is also an atheist and has a very scientific approach to dealing with everything. And whenever something happens, there's certainly no element of a divine power at play or anything like that. Everything's explainable through science. And so for Christians, sometimes they look at the field of anthropology and they say, well, Christians shouldn't have anything to do with that. Missionaries shouldn't have anything to do with that because there's no allowance for God in that picture. And we need to perhaps think of it a little bit differently. So if anthropologists have been suspicious of missionaries, missionaries have been slow to appreciate the insights that anthropology has to offer them. And I want to speak to you about a couple of people, a couple of missionaries who have been able to bridge that gap, or at least Christian thinkers, I should say. One of those is Paul Hibbert. Several years ago, he wrote a book called Anthropological Insights for Missionaries, which is still available today and is still a tremendous resource, in which he very clearly draws upon the several anthropological insights that are eminently practical for missionaries and indeed for everybody. And he described the relationship very often between anthropologists and missionaries as a love-hate relationship. Lut Batak who wrote a book in 1985, called for a better understanding and a closer cooperation between these two antagonistic groups. Kenelm Burridge wrote a piece in 1991, was more sympathetic and understanding of missionaries than most anthropologists, and he documents this long ambivalence between the two. But Malinowski, who I quote here, he actually began calling for the use of anthropology as early as 1929, and he actually said the time has come for missionaries to appreciate anthropological insights in the real world. He says the science which claims to understand culture, to have a clue to racial problems, must not remain silent on the drama of cultural conflict and of racial clash. Anthropology must become an applied science. And really at the heart of missions and missionary work, isn't it very practical in nature? Of course it is. There's real tangible results that we are seeking to attain, and so if practical anthropology can be very, very beneficial to us. Also, if you delve back a little bit into history, as missions was climbing out of the ethnocentric colonialistic era of the late 1800s and into the 1900s, we begin to see a little bit of a shift, if you will, in emphasis. And part of that was highlighted really in the Missionary Conference of 1910. Now, these missionary conferences have been held every 6 or 7 years or so, ever since the mid-1850s. But this was the first time at the missionary conference where they actually began to popularize the idea of missionaries having more than just a copy of the Bible with them when they go around the world. In fact, one of the statements that's made here that I've highlighted said that she ought to be versed in the genius of the people, that which has made them the people that they are, the genius of the people. So now we're moving beyond saying let's go overseas and civilize the natives because, you know, they're so primitive, they're so primal, they have no knowledge of themselves, of the world around them, they have no knowledge of God, certainly, and so we need to be able to take that to them. Now they're saying, actually, there's something to these people. And you know what? Maybe there's something that they can actually teach us themselves. So it was really a breakthrough period, which unfortunately, even though it was more than 100 years ago, still by some people and some groups hasn't really been taken on board. But another proponent, one of the earliest proponents of using anthropological insights in mission, was a man named Edwin Smith. Now, Edwin Smith was a missionary to Zambia in the early 1900s, to the Batoga people. And he often called himself an amateur anthropologist. But you see what he says here? He says the science of social anthropology should be recognized as an essential discipline in the training of missionaries. Because as he goes on to say, and I really would like this to be ringing through your ears during the course of this semester, tact is not enough, nor is love. Tact needs to be based on knowledge. Love there can hardly be without understanding. Wow, I think that's very profound. Because often we hear rhetoric that says, well, all you need is the Bible and goodwill and good intentions, and God will do the rest. We can be loving, we can be tactful, and he says, no, hang on, this tact that we talk about, it needs to be based on something. It needs to have knowledge, a mutual respect. If we don't understand the people that we're going to, can we truly say that we love them? We don't love them enough to know anything about them. How loving is that really? And interestingly enough, Edwin Smith is, to date, the only missionary who has ever served as the president of the Royal Anthropological Institute of Great Britain. He was a member, and from 1933 to 1935, he was the president, and like I say, the first and only missionary to have ever held that position. Quite interesting and perhaps a little sad as well. But as we look at the other side of the coin, what do anthropologists think of missionaries? Well, as we said, there's been an ambivalent relationship, but perhaps an underappreciation for the good work that missionaries have done to contribute to the field of anthropology as well. In fact, Junod was one of the first to actually write about that, where he actually said he wished anthropologists would realize that they owe some kind of debt to missionary work. And at the bottom there, he says it's not accidental if sometimes missionaries have proved to be the best anthropologists. And in reality, that should be the case, shouldn't it? Because if you're out there and you're dealing with people and you're talking with them about the deep things of life, surely that should give you some insight into how people are and what really pushes their buttons, if you will. So they should be some of the best anthropologists. Now, when it comes to studying anthropology, obviously Christian institutions have been a little bit slow to actually figuring out how best to do this. Wheaton College was one of the first to do that, which is Billy Graham's alma mater. And they began with a major in anthropology way back in the 1940s and 50s, where they began a program of anthropology training, and was one of the first Christian universities to do so, where somebody could actually become a major in anthropology at a Christian university. But probably a high point for Christian anthropology came with Eugene Nider's book, you can see at the bottom there, Customs and Cultures, Anthropology for Christian Mission. And even though that's very dated, came out in 1954, so there's been many, many books written since about this topic. Eugene Nider is always quoted in those books. He's always seen as somebody who knew what he was talking about. One of the articles that I have given you to read for this week is actually written by Robert Priest, where he talks about some of the developments of missions in anthropology, and I really encourage you to read that carefully, because he speaks about some of the things that missions and anthropology have been able to do together in the last 50, 60 years, which has shown a mutual appreciation of each other's field. You just think of something like Bible translation for a moment. Well, is Bible translation a anthropological task, or is it a missiological task? It's both, isn't it? You need to have an understanding of the Bible and of doctrine, of course, if you're going to translate God's Word. But you also need to have an understanding of the culture of the people, what words they use, what do these words mean, why did these words mean this and not that in those cultures. It's not as easy as you might think. If you've ever spoken to somebody who's involved in Bible translation, or Wycliffe Bible translators, people like that, they'll tell you that it's very much a cultural exercise as much as it is an etymological one. So in conclusion then, can mission and anthropology work together? I would say yes, they should. And one of the concluding things I'll say about that is that missiological anthropology would benefit if there were more Christians in anthropology involved in scholarship or in all anthropological topics. You see, Christians need to not shy away from the science of anthropology for fear that it is watering down the gospel, or that we're not sticking to the main thing. We need to instead say, this is a very important field that will help me become better at what I do. That's one of the reasons why I've given you an assignment in this class involving ethnographic study. Ethnographic study is a basic, rudimentary concept that all anthropologists in the secular field would study. But it's very rarely studied within a missiological context. And so I've given you that as an assignment, which hopefully you'll find would be very, very practical, and you'll immediately see why this would be important in a field like Christian mission, for example. So that concludes our understanding of mission and anthropology, an introduction. Some of the readings and other things you'll be doing this week will hopefully round that off for you, and I look forward to hearing from you in the discussion forums and the rest of our interactive work this week.